Welcome back to week number 2 in our focus series, Getting a Clear View of the Real God. Today we're going to look at a quality of God that is somewhat controversial these days. It's called the sovereignty of God. What does that mean anyways? If God's in control of things, then why do bad things happen to people we know and love? Where does God's control end and my free will begin? Well, as we get started, I'd like to take a moment and have you discuss as a group, what does the word sovereign mean? When you hear the sovereignty of God, how would you define God's sovereignty? Go ahead and take a few minutes. Well, I hope you had a fun and maybe a spirited discussion around that question, what is the sovereignty of God? What does that phrase mean, the sovereignty of God? Well, an easy way for me to remember what the sovereignty of God means is found right in the middle of that word sovereign. It's the word reign. This word means that God is in control. It was a word used to describe royalty, as subjects would bow before a king. We believe that God is ruler over all. A further definition that might help is from a website called gotquestions.org. And they define the sovereignty of God as this. The sovereignty of God means that He is in total control of all things, past, present, and future. Nothing happens that is outside of His knowledge and control. All things are either caused by Him or allowed by Him for His own purpose, His own glory, and through His perfect will and timing. Well, let's break that down just a little bit. The sovereignty of God means that God is over all. He is ruler over all. Colossians 1:16 says this, "For through Him God created everything in the heavenly realms and on earth. He made the things we can see and the things we can't see, such as thrones, kingdoms, rulers, and authorities in the unseen world. Everything was created through Him and for Him." The Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 11 also talks about the sovereignty of God. He says this, "Oh, how great are the God's riches and wisdom and knowledge! How impossible it is for us to understand His decision and His ways. For who can know the Lord's thoughts? And who knows enough to give Him advice? And who has given Him so much that He needs to pay it back?" And Paul ends Romans chapter 11 with verse 36. He says, "For everything comes from Him and exists by His power and is intended for His glory. All glory to Him forever. Amen." Everything comes from Him, it exists by His power, and is intended for His glory. A second thing that the sovereignty of God means is that God can cause all things to work together for good. A few pages earlier, Paul wrote in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, "And we know that God causes everything to work together for good for those who love God and are called according to His purpose for them." Now, not everything that happens to us in our life is good. It can be tragic, it can be hard, it can be heartbreaking. But somehow, some way, God can even bring something good from the heartbreaks that we have experienced in life. In Isaiah chapter 61, it says this, "To all who mourn in Israel, He will give a crown of beauty for ashes, a joyous blessing instead of mourning, festive praise instead of despair. In their righteousness they will be like great oaks that the Lord has planted for His own glory." God can bring beauty from ashes in our life. He can bring something good out of the heartaches and hardships that we face. Have you ever wondered whether God is really in control? If He is, then why do bad things happen to good people? Well, I've invited some of my friends here on staff at New Life who've gone through some very deep waters to tell us a little bit about their story and how they wrestled with God's sovereignty and how they discovered God in the midst of their pain. Let's listen.
Hi, my name is Janice Horsham, and I work at the church. I'm a graphic designer. I've worked here for almost 12 years. I'm the mother of 3 kids, Tiffany, Brady, and Hadley. And 3 years ago, I lost my husband. They lost their father, and it was completely unexpected. He got sick on a Thursday and died on a Tuesday night. And that's my story about why I'm here.
My story goes back to 2010. The month of February. Sue and I were coming back from a vacation down in the California desert, and we thought the trip would take about 7 hours, because that's the norm. It turned out it would be about 7 weeks before we would re-enter the Turlock city limits. Sue was driving. I was asleep in the passenger seat, reclined in the seat. And as she slowed down due to traffic and road work, we were hit from behind at 65 miles an hour, according to the CHP report. The car hit the back of our car, which then pushed in that all the way through the second seat and then into the seat that I was in, basically crushing that and then crushing my back at the same time, in the same process. Sue got out of the car fairly quickly and went to the hospital and was checked out and was fine. I was not so fortunate because of the nature of being reclined. It took about an hour for the responders to get me out using the jaws of life, and then I was transported to Loma Linda Hospital.
Hi, my name's John Nichols, and I'm the outreach pastor here at New Life. And when our son was about 4 years old, he was diagnosed with autism, and it was like we were hit by a hurricane, a tornado, and an earthquake all in the same day. We felt devastated. We felt like most of our dreams for him had somehow died. There wasn't going to be playing catch with him. There wasn't going to be walking or seeing him watch his bride of the future walk down the aisle. Lots of things that we had to wrestle with.
I am still wrestling with the sovereignty of God, and knowing that He is the God who He says He is, that's what sovereign means to me, is that He is always there. He's never going to change. He's never going to leave me. But more importantly for me and my story and what I'm teaching my kids about God in this process is that at the end of all of this the bottom line of all of this is we have hope. Hope is what keeps me getting up every morning and looking for the future, so that I get to see my kids and I get to see a glimpse of my husband in my children because of the hope that I have in Christ.
The issue of God's sovereignty is one that I of course struggled with through this. I've seen in my entire life from the time I was a young person and parents passing away and living with guardians, I've seen God work and have observed that my life does not follow necessarily man's plan, but God's plan. And I have kind of grappled with God's sovereignty throughout my time on this earth. This has caused me to grapple with it even in a more intense way, realizing this was a choice that God made to allow this to happen. And I had and have choices to either accept that and accept His will and accept what He's done, or fight it and be angry about it and resentful. And I can't sit here and say that there aren't times that I'm not resentful, not times when it's difficult to accept. For example, I can't play baseball and basketball with my grandsons like I'd like to. I can't backpack anymore. I miss those things a lot. But in the overall scheme of things, when I remind myself that I shouldn't have survived the surgery based on the doctors at Loma Linda, I shouldn't really be walking again, the fact that I can fills me with so much gratitude that it's not easy to be grateful. So God's sovereignty is something I really do accept and I grab onto. I believe in wholeheartedly before this incident, during the incident, and now after.
Over the years, He's shown us so many different things. He's shown us perseverance. He's shown us how to have joy even when you don't necessarily feel it. He's taught us about believing in Him even when we don't get the answer that we want. Realizing that He is sovereign, that He is in charge, and that He's got us. I think the greatest thing that I've learned is that He really will never leave us or forsake us. Such an amazing promise. And I'm thankful too, because there's so many things that we thought we would never see. Like we thought we'd never see Colby ride his bike by himself, and he rides that thing like a stunt rider. And we thought we'd never see him be able to swim without a life jacket, and he's swimming 10 laps back and forth across the pool now, and he just loves it. And I think one of the greatest things was his 8th grade graduation. We were sitting up in the stands, and they call actually each student said their name, and most people just say their name, but Colby, they pre-recorded this, and Colby said, "Colby Ryan Nichols!" And the whole place erupted. And he could almost hardly walk because he was laughing so hard, and it was just the greatest thing. And people behind us who we didn't even know said, "That kid is always happy." And I'm thankful for that. God has given us a happy, kind, loving son. And his future is bright because God has us in his hands. And so every day, we're just learning to trust him more and more.
Wow. You can feel the pain in those stories, can't you? I can't imagine how challenging it has been and continues to be for each one of these dear people. You know, one of my favorite characters lately in the Bible has been Joseph. Joseph is in the Old Testament in Genesis. His story begins in chapter 37, and he went through a decade of being rejected and forgotten, abused and abandoned by his brother. Finally, after 13 years, God turned the story around so that by the end of the story, Joseph has forgiven his brothers. His brothers were afraid that now that their father had passed away, that Joseph would seek revenge. But when you read the rest of the end of the story in Genesis chapter 50, verse 19, Joseph says this to his brothers, "Don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you? You intended it for harm, to harm me, but God intended it for good. He brought me to this position so that I could save the lives of many people." Those brothers intended it for harm, but God used it for good. And God can do that in our lives as well. As you go to your groups now, I'm going to ask the leader of your group to start with this question. How have you seen God work for the good of those who love him in a painful or tragic circumstance in your life? I hope you have a great time around this subject. And enjoy. God bless.